They said Clara Whitmore had dug her cellar too deep, so deep, in fact, that if anything ever went wrong, she'd trap herself instead of saving herself. But 6 days later, when the worst blizzard in Jefferson County history swallowed entire homes and silenced the power grid, the only place people were still breathing warm, steady air was beneath her house, in the space everyone had laughed at, though back in early autumn. None of that seemed possible, and Clara, at 71, looked exactly like the kind of woman people quietly dismissed, the kind who had outlived her usefulness but refused to admit it, living alone on a weathered patch of land just outside town where the wind never really stopped and the nights came in colder than forecasts ever predicted. And yet while others were downsizing or moving closer to their families, Clara was doing something else entirely. She was digging, not just maintaining the old root cellar beneath her farmhouse, but expanding it, reinforcing it. And then, without any announcement or approval, going deeper than anyone in town thought was necessary or safe, because the original cellar, built decades ago by her late husband, had always been enough for storing preserves, potatoes, and winter supplies. But Clara didn't stop there. She had a crew come out just once, long enough to break through the lower foundation and set the initial structure. And after that she worked alone, methodical and patient, lowering herself down each morning with tools, hauling up soil in buckets, reinforcing walls with poured concrete rings that arrived in staggered deliveries, the kind that made neighbors pause when they drove past. Because in a place like Jefferson County, nothing unusual stayed unnoticed for long. And soon enough the question started, first casual, then pointed, then mocking, as people gathered at the local diner or the hardware store and traded theories about what Clara was doing under her house. Storm shelter? Someone guessed. More like a bunker. Another replied. From what? Came the laughter. And eventually the phrase stuck, repeated enough times to become its own kind of truth. Too deep, they said, shaking their heads, because everyone knew cellars had limits. There was a point where digging further didn't make you safer. It just made you foolish, especially at her age. And yet Clara never corrected them, never offered an explanation. Not when she ordered specialized ventilation pipes that could be hand-cranked. Not when she installed a secondary hatch between the upper and lower levels. Not even when she began stocking supplies in a way that didn't match any normal household rhythm. Rotating canned goods with near-military precision, storing water in sealed drums, testing airflow systems late into the evening when most people had already settled into their routines, because what they didn't know, what she never said, was that Clara wasn't preparing out of fear. She was preparing out of memory, the kind that didn't fade with time but sharpened instead, the kind that came from a winter long before Jefferson County had better forecasts and stronger infrastructure. Back when she was a young woman in North Dakota, trapped beneath 6 feet of snow in a storm shelter that barely held, listening to the wind erase the world above her while her father rationed air and her mother kept them calm with stories that grew quieter as the hours stretched on. And what Clara remembered most wasn't the cold, it was the waiting, the uncertainty of not knowing if the space around you would hold long enough, if the air would last, if the structure above you would collapse or freeze solid before help could ever arrive. And so when she built her second cellar, she didn't just think about storage, she thought about time, about insulation, about systems that didn't rely on electricity or fuel that could run out. She designed it so the earth itself would become protection, so that the deeper level would maintain a stable temperature no matter how violent the storm above became, with reinforced walls that resisted shifting soil, a sealed hatch that could isolate the lower chamber completely, and a ventilation system angled carefully to avoid blockage from drifting snow. Something most people never considered until it was too late. And by the time autumn settled in and the first frost touched the ground, Clara's work was finished, though nothing about her property looked dramatically different from the outside. Just the same aging farmhouse, the same quiet stretch of land, the same woman moving through her routines without drawing attention to herself, except for those who had been watching closely, those who noticed how deliveries had stopped, how the digging had ended, how everything seemed ready. And that was the part that unsettled people most, because preparation on that level didn't feel casual. It felt deliberate, like she knew something they didn't, and still, no one asked her directly. Not really, because it was easier to laugh, easier to dismiss, Easier to believe that whatever Clara Whitmore was building beneath her house was unnecessary, excessive, maybe even a little unhinged. And as winter approached, the town returned to its usual rhythm, stacking firewood, checking heaters, trusting the systems they had always relied on. While Clara did something quieter, something almost invisible. She tested her seals, checked Hervapos supplies one last time, and then she waited, not with anxiety, not with urgency, but with the calm patience of someone who had already lived through what others only imagined. Because to Clara, the question had never been whether a storm would come, only whether it would be the kind that proved everyone else wrong. The warning didn't sound any different from the dozens that had come before it. Just another winter advisory scrolling across screens and crackling over radios. The kind people in Jefferson County had learned to half-listen to while continuing their routines. But this time, long before the first snowflake fell, Clara Whitmore had already sealed the upper hatch of her cellar and moved her essentials into the deeper level, as if she were responding not to the forecast, but to something older and more instinctive. And when the storm finally arrived, it did so without drama, no thunder, no sudden burst of chaos, just a slow tightening of the world as the wind picked up and refused to let go, carrying snow sideways in thick, relentless sheets that erased distance and direction alike, until roads blurred into fields and fields into nothing at all, and by nightfall the county was already struggling to keep up, plows falling behind, visibility dropping faster than expected, but still, no one panicked, because storms always started this way, manageable at first, predictable even, until sometime during the early hours of the next morning, the temperature dropped, not gradually, but sharply, plunging past what had been forecast into a range that tested even well-insulated homes, and with it came a silence that didn't feel natural, as if the storm had settled in a place rather than passing through. And that was when the first failures began, quietly at first, a flicker of lights here, a generator stuttering there, until entire sections of the county went dark, power lines snapping under the weight of ice and wind, leaving houses to rely on backup systems that had always been good enough. Except now, they weren't, because fuel thickened in the cold, engines struggled to turn over, and heating systems that depended on electricity simply stopped, one by one, until warmth became something people had to fight to keep instead of something they could expect. And inside the Miller family home, just a few miles from Clara's property, that fight began on the second night, when the temperature inside dropped low enough that their breath became visible in the air, even with layers of clothing and every blanket they owned pulled tight around them. "It'll pass," Mr. Miller kept saying, more out of habit than certainty, adjusting the thermostat even though the system wasn't responding the way it should, while Mrs. Miller sealed windows with towels and tape, trying to block drafts that seemed to find their way through every crack no matter what she did, because the wind wasn't just outside anymore. It was pressing in, testing the house from every angle, finding weaknesses in places they'd never noticed before. And by the third day, something shifted, not just in the storm, but in the understanding of it, because it didn't move on the way storms were supposed to. It didn't weaken or drift, it stayed, anchored over the county like a weight that refused to lift, and the snow kept falling, faster than it could settle, building drifts that climbed past windows and doors, sealing people inside whether they were prepared or not. And that was when the real danger began, not the dramatic kind, but the slow, creeping kind that gave no clear moment of crisis, only a steady decline, as heat leaked away from homes that had always been trusted to hold it, as pipes began to freeze in the walls, as batteries drained faster than expected, and as the realization set in, that help wasn't coming anytime soon, because emergency services were overwhelmed, roads were impassable, and communication lines were failing across the region, leaving people to rely on whatever they had. And whatever they had was running out. And through it all, no one thought about Clara Whitmore, not at first, because her house sat far enough from the main road to be out of sight and out of mind. Just another old structure on the edge of town, until sometime late on the third night, when the storm had reached a point where even the most prepared households were struggling. Someone noticed something strange through the blur of wind and snow. A section of land where the drifts didn't seem to pile the same way, where the wind curved instead of crashing, and where, despite everything, there was no flicker of distress, no signs of a failing system. just stillness. And though it was nearly impossible to see clearly, the shape of Clara's farmhouse stood there, half buried but unchanged, as if the storm had chosen to pass over it rather than tear into it. And inside, beneath that house, 2 levels down, Clara moved with quiet precision, her world reduced to the steady rhythm of systems she had built herself. The low burn of the cast-iron stove, the controlled flow of air through the ventilation pipes, the measured use of stored water and food, every action deliberate, every decision made long before the storm had ever been named, because this was what she had prepared for. Not the idea of a storm, but the reality of one that didn't behave the way people expected, one that lingered, that pressed, that tested not just structures but assumptions. And as the hours stretched into days, and the days into something heavier and more uncertain, the gap between those who had prepared for inconvenience and the one who had prepared for survival began to widen, quietly at first, then unmistakably, until by the 4th morning, in homes where the cold had settled deep into the walls and the last reliable heat sources were failing, a single thought began to take hold, reluctant and uneasy, but impossible to ignore, that maybe Clara Whitmore hadn't dug too deep after all, that maybe, in a storm that refused to end, depth wasn't a mistake, but the only thing standing between endurance and collapse. By the 4th day, the storm had stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like something deliberate, something that had settled over Jefferson County with no intention of leaving, and inside homes that had always been considered safe. The reality was no longer a question of comfort, but of survival, as temperatures dropped to levels that crept into bone and breath alike, and systems people had trusted for years began to fail in ways they had never prepared for. And in the Miller house, the decision came quietly, without argument, because there was nothing left to debate. The generator had finally given out sometime before dawn. The last of their firewood was burning faster than it should, and the cold inside had reached a point where staying meant waiting for something worse than discomfort. So Mr. Miller layered on every piece of clothing he could find, wrapped scarves around his children's faces, and forced the front door open against a wall of packed snow that resisted, like something solid. And when it finally gave way, the world outside wasn't a landscape anymore. It was a blur of white and wind that erased direction and distance. But they stepped into it anyway, because the only alternative was to stay and freeze. And somewhere beyond the storm, barely visible through shifting walls of snow, was Clara Whitmore's property, the place no one had taken seriously until now, and the walk that should have taken minutes stretched into something far longer, each step swallowed almost as soon as it was made, the wind pushing them sideways, stealing breath and balance, until even the idea of turning back felt just as dangerous as moving forward. And more than once, they nearly lost sight of each other, calling out through layers of fabric and wind that carried their voices away. But eventually, through instinct or stubbornness or something deeper that refused to give up, they reached it. The farmhouse, half buried, nearly indistinguishable from the drifts. Around it, silent and still, with no visible sign of life. And for a moment, doubt crept in, because what if they had come all this way for nothing? What if the rumors had been wrong? What if too deep had meant something else entirely? But then Mrs. Miller saw it. Not the door, which was nearly sealed shut by snow, but the side of the house where the wind had carved a shallow recess, exposing a section of ground that shouldn't have been visible. And there, partially hidden but unmistakable, was a reinforced hatch, its edges lined with metal instead of wood, its surface clear of the thick ice that coated everything else, as if it had been designed for exactly this moment. And they didn't hesitate, not anymore, because hesitation belonged to a time before the storm, and now every second mattered. So Mr. Miller forced it open, revealing a narrow ladder descending into darkness that felt less like absence and more like shelter, and one by one, they climbed down, pulling the hatch closed behind them as the wind roared overhead. And the difference was immediate, not warm yet, but protected, the first cellar cutting away the violence of the storm, replacing it with a stillness that felt almost unreal after days of constant pressure. And at the far end of that space was another door, heavier, sealed tight, the boundary between what most people would have built and what Clara had chosen to create. And when he knocked, the sound carried differently here, solid, contained, and, for a moment there was nothing, just the quiet hum of enclosed space, until the hatch opened inward with controlled ease, and warm air rose up, not in a rush, but in a steady, even flow that spoke of something stable and sustained. And Clara stood there, lantern in hand, her expression unchanged from the way it had always been in town, calm, unsurprised, as if this moment had already happened in her mind long before it ever became real. "You found it," she said simply, stepping aside to let them in. And inside the lower cellar, everything shifted, not just in temperature, but in feeling, because this wasn't a place fighting the storm, it was a place removed from it entirely, the deeper earth holding a constant warmth that didn't rely on failing systems, the reinforced walls trapping heat from a low-burning stove that didn't need to work hard to maintain the space, the air moving slowly and deliberately through a ventilation system that continued to function no matter what happened above. And over the next day, more people arrived, some guided by the miller's path, others by the faint understanding that if there was anywhere left that could hold against the storm, it would be here, beneath the house everyone had once laughed at. And Clara let them in without question, organizing space with quiet efficiency, rationing supplies in a way that ensured time instead of urgency, assigning places to sleep, to sit, to breathe, until the cellar became something more than a shelter. It became a system, one designed not just to endure, but to outlast. And above them, the storm continued for 2 more days before finally breaking, its grip loosening as suddenly as it had taken hold, leaving behind a county that looked less like a place people lived and more like something abandoned to the cold. And when emergency crews finally made their way through, they found homes collapsed under the weight of snow, pipes shattered from freezing, families huddled in whatever spaces had held long enough, and one farmhouse that appeared almost lost beneath the drifts. But when they uncovered the hatch and climbed down, they found something no one had expected. Not survivors clinging to the last of their strength, but people stable, warm, and waiting, because Clara Whitmore hadn't built for the storm people expected. She had built for the one they didn't. And in the weeks that followed, as the county thawed and stories spread, no one used the phrase, "too deep," anymore, not with doubt or mockery, but with something closer to understanding, because they had seen what depth could do when everything above failed. And Clara, as always, didn't explain, didn't take credit, didn't remind anyone of what they had said before. She simply maintained what she had built, checking seals, rotating supplies, preparing in the same quiet way she always had, because for her, the lesson had never changed. Safety wasn't about what stood against the storm, it was about what remained when the storm refused to leave.